Hello, friends, and greetings from the Overflow Room. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with a talk about one of my very, very favorite symphonies, Dvorak Symphony Number 5. I mean the real number 5, not the old number 5, because the old number 5, some of you may recall, and you may still see on reproductions of old record covers, the old number 5 was number 9, the New World Symphony, that used to be known as number 5, in which case number 6 was number 1, number 7 was number 2, number 5 was number 3, number 8 was number 4, and number 9 was number 5. Then the first 4 earlier symphonies were rediscovered, and everything had to get renumbered. Dvorak himself thought that number 5 was number 4, because number 1 was lost. And if that isn't complicated enough, let's not worry about it, because we're only talking about the real number 5. Now, this symphony is absolutely one of the great masterpieces of 19th century symphonic writing, and the reason for its neglect is completely, totally unaccountable. It is a work of shattering genius. Donald Tovey thought so, and he was kind of picky when it came to things like that. He really was. And the only reason I can think of for its neglect is that it seems that Dvorak's music is not paid attention to until after it shows, or can be assumed to show, because that's a big question, we'll get to in a moment, assumed to show the influence of Brahms, because that makes it self-evidently important, right? I mean, I just hate the way, musicology and music history is written when it comes to Dvorak and to composers who are not German. It's so full of unconscious nationalistic bias that we don't even remember anymore because we weren't around at the time, but the myths linger on. And why do they linger? They linger because nobody is listening, because even musicologists would rather talk about music than actually hear it as often as not. And to right that wrong, I wrote a paper, which was published here in this lovely coffee table book called Symphonism in 19th Century Europe. The paper was called Dvorak's Fifth, a politically incorrect inspiration for Brahms' Third Symphony, ? Something like that title. Because here's the thing, I didn't have formal musical training or education, as is true of many of you. We all just love music and we listen to it, right? I mean, I'm essentially completely self-taught when it comes to music. And so when I didn't know Brahms was like a big deal. Brahms First was always my mother's favorite symphony. It was the music she listened to when she vacuumed. And that's how I thought of Brahms. Dvorak I just loved from the minute I first heard him, probably because the tunes are so great. So I knew Dvorak's Fifth from the early days. In fact, I had the old Carol Shaner recording on Superphone in rather dim sound. Wonderful performance, not great sound. I got it from Goodwill Industries because they had a pile of records that they were selling for a nickel each. And I would bicycle downtown Milford, and the Goodwill was next to the firehouse, and I would come home with a stack of records. God knows where they came from. And someone had all the old Superphone monos of the Dvorak symphonies. And so I got all the Dvorak symphonies. And I would play them in my little close and play record with the 5-pound tone arm. They were good for a few plays each, and then the grooves were worn out. And so I knew Dvorak's Fifth. I knew it from a very, very early age. Literally from my early teens. And I loved it. I just loved it. Then I started to listen to Brahms. And when I got to Brahms' Third Symphony, I put on Brahms' Third and I went, whoa, that's Dvorak's Fifth, Brahmsified. I mean, I just heard it immediately. And, I thought, well, okay, I talked to people about it. They said, no, it's the other way around. It's impossible. So I did a little research for my paper. And it turns out, first of all, I'm not the first pseudo-scholar. I mean, I'm a pseudo-scholar. Real scholars have suggested this, but very delicately, because you have to be careful not to cross the Brahms people. They're much more important and bigger names than the Dvorak people. So I found a paper where someone very gently suggested that there were elements of Dvorak's Fifth that Brahms might have been interested in. Well, I mean, I'm don't have anything to lose. I have no reputation to preserve, as some of you will probably readily agree. So I went all the way and I said, hold it a minute. Let's just look at the evidence. The fact of the matter is that Dvorak's first 5 symphonies were all composed before Brahms first appeared, and the 5th was the last of them. It was written in 1875, and Brahms first appeared in 1876. And of course, the 3rd wasn't until the 1880s. At that time, Dvorak and Brahms had become friends, and Brahms was very excited about the 3rd and very happy to play the outer movements to Dvorak on the piano. And one can only imagine how that conversation went. We have a letter from Dvorak talking about it, saying, I met with Brahms. He played me the outer movements of his 3rd Symphony. It's incredibly beautiful. I loved it. Unfortunately, he did not say that Brahms said, ha, listen to this. Sound familiar? Who knows what the conversation was. But I'm going to take you through Dvorak's 5th for itself, just to show you what an incredible work of genius it is, because we know that Brahms knew it. We knew it because it was one of the symphonies that Dvorak submitted to receive the stipendium for the Austrian National Prize thing that he had been receiving for several years. And Brahms was on the jury. And Brahms was very careful about going through the manuscripts that were sent in and making comments and marginal comments and things. I would love to see if there's a manuscript with maybe some marginal comments in Brahms' hand. Who knows? But Dvorak's first 3 symphonies were known to Brahms before Brahms wrote his 3rd. In fact, before Brahms published his first, which is really kind of fascinating. And Brahms did own the score of Dvorak's 5th, but a published score, and that didn't come out till the late 1880s. So we can't deduce any evidence from there. No, the evidence has to be musical. It has to be musical. And in a macroscopic sense, what is interesting is that both symphonies are in F major, with a sort of audible influence from Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony, quite possibly. Both symphonies are major key symphonies with minor key finales, which is quite unusual in and of itself. But the most interesting comparison between the two comes from the thematic workmanship of the Dvorak 5th, which is audibly echoed in the Brahms 3rd in lots and lots and lots of ways. And we'll talk about them as we go. I really want to do a little analysis of this symphony, a little audible analysis, just so you can hear and answer the musical question. What is it about this symphony that might have fascinated a composer like Brahms, who was, the acme of the sophisticated reinterpretation of classical forms and symphonic development and thematic and motivic workmanship? And Dvorak's 5th has all of those things. And it has them in a way which is absolutely unique for itself and for its period, and is just the kind of thing, I think, that would have fascinated Brahms when he came to write his 3rd Symphony. It really is. I'm not kidding. So let's talk about the Dvorak 5th a little bit. I think we should chat about it and see what we have. I have some wonderful music examples taken from, hang on a moment here, this superb performance by Václav Neumann with the Czech Philharmonic on Superphone. So thank you, Superphone, for permission to use samples. This is a great performance, by the way. And when we get to the recordings, obviously this will be one of them. I'm only going to talk about the top 5 recordings of the 5th. I don't see any point in going through all the rest because, for reasons we'll get to when we get to it. Let's start with talking about this symphony. What makes it so fascinating? Well, first of all, the symphony is in cyclical form, but a very sophisticated kind of cyclical form. Most people think of cyclical form in sort of the Franck and Bruckner sense. That is, at the very end, the opening theme comes back. That's cyclical. Well, this symphony does do that, as does Brahms' 3rd, by the way. They both do that. But that's not the most important thing. The Dvorak 5th opens with a sort of introduction that has 2 elements, and I'm going to play them for you. I'm going to use this as my hide my face while I play the musical example thing, so you don't have to stare at me the whole time. But those 2 things are a fanfare. The 2 elements in the initial phrase are a fanfare on the clarinets, and then a rising arpeggio that just goes da, 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 da. That little rhythm at the end, that da-da, turns out to be very important because it's one of the ways you recognize this thing whenever it comes back. So I'm going to play you the opening phrase. Here it is. Okay, very simple, right? Very beautiful, charming fanfare on the clarinets. It gets repeated. And now I want you to hear it again. I've separated its two elements by putting a pause between them, just to make it easier for you to hear them separate, because Dvorak is going to treat them separately. And the most important one is the second phrase, that rising arpeggio, da, 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 da. That fanfare thing is adorable, and you hear it throughout the first movement, and again at the very end of the finale to put the capstone on the whole symphony. But that's not the thing that's going to make the most difference. So let's listen to it again with a little pause between the two bits, just so you get it into your head. Okay, now, this little rising arpeggio is going to have amazing things happen to it. Unbelievably amazing things. And let me explain to you what they are. First of all, the second movement is the slow movement, and the third movement is the scherzo. These two movements are related. They are mirror images of each other. They have the same form, and they're based on variations of the same themes. They are in ABA form. Simple song form, as it's sometimes called. Now, the B section, the middle section, consists entirely of variations of that arpeggio inverted, played upside down. So instead of da, 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 it's da, 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 right? That's all it is, upside down. But it's varied, so it's expanded and contracted and futzed with, and all kinds of things happen. So let me play you the B section of the Andante, the second movement, and you will hear the upside down version, da, 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 of that arpeggio. And the way we know it's that is because of that rhythm. The rhythm, bum, bum, da, dum. That is what tells you what we're dealing with for the most part. So here it is. I'm sure you can hear that very clearly. It's 3 notes up, 3 notes down. The last one is a da-dum. Now, when we get to the scherzo, we hear a middle section, the B section, which is yet another variation of the same thing, which it's so cool the way Dvorak does this, because none of this sounds artificial or intellectual. It's all as breezy and improvisational and fresh and free as can be. But the thematic workmanship is absolute and brilliantly worked out. So here is a bit of the trio, the middle section of the scherzo, based on the same idea. All right, got it? So then we come to the finale. Now, in the finale, that theme is again reimagined, but this time as the second subject, the lyrical second subject in a sonata form movement. And now it's become da, 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 da. It's audibly the same tune. And you still hear those little rhythmic steps, originally just on the last note, but gradually being added to the other two. But it's let's use the Brahmsian terminology that Schoenberg invented for his essay, Brahms the Progressive. It's a progressive variation. That's what it is. And here is the version that we hear in the finale. Now, it's only at the very, very end of the symphony that marvelous little motive is stuck right side up. Just when the whole argument's over and we think it's all done, it finally returns in its original form to usher in the brilliant, lively coda. One of the big differences with Brahms' third, because as we know, Brahms' third ends in elegiac reverie, whereas the Dvorak is a rah-rah, razzle-dazzle, young man's ending. But anyway, here is the return of that arpeggio at the very end of the finale. So you see, this is one of the threads that moves through the entire symphony. But again, when we talk about cyclical form here, we're talking about the classical version of it. If you've been watching my Haydn Symphony Crusade, you will have noticed that I talk an awful lot about how Haydn unifies his symphonies through use of motives and textures and timbres, all without having to repeat themes. Dvorak does repeat that fanfare, that opening fanfare at the very end. Otherwise, there are no repeated themes. He transforms them, but the transformations are audible, and that's the point. You can follow them very easily if you know the symphony well enough and if you pay attention to it. If you don't know the symphony, if it's the first time you're hearing it, or you've heard it a few times and you haven't noticed, as most of the people who've analyzed it have never noticed for some reason, it will hit you eventually. You get subconsciously, you get the identity as the music plays, something that sounds sort of more familiar than not. And that creates that sense of organic unity. And that, my friends, is something that Brahms would have really noticed and admired, because that is how Brahms operated too. That was the classical model that Brahms's life project was reinvigorating, and it became Dvorak's too. And the interesting thing is that it became Dvorak's project before he met Brahms. Quite a while before he met Brahms. That was the direction he was heading. And that's why the two of them got on so well. Not because Brahms was better and Dvorak was sitting at his feet, humbly drinking in the well of Germanic greatness, because they were simply two geniuses who were congruent. They were headed in the same direction. They admired the same things, and they adopted some of the same techniques. And we're not done. We're not done, because Dvorak's Fifth has another motive, what you might call a head motive, a rhythmic motive, of the type that you often find in Brahms and that you often hear in Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven. The head motive is a simple rhythmic idea in the form long, short, short, long. Dum, da, da, dum. Dum, da, da, dum, or dum, da, da, dum. It depends on how it's accented, but it's long, short, short, long. That is the head motive. You first hear it as the principal tutti theme, the loud theme, the first subject or the second half of the first subject, depending on how you analyze Dvořák's first movement. But you hear it in the first movement, and it's emphasized over and 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 over. So here it is, both as he first presents it in the first loud section, and then as you hear it as the exposition goes on. Because you'll see, it detaches. Initially, it's part of a tune. Da 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 dum ba da da dum ba ba da 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 dum. Right? It's a tune. But then it detaches, and Dvořák deliberately detaches it so you remember it. So let's listen to that, shall we? Now, this little motive, long, short, short, long, is going to lead off every single movement in the symphony. It's the opening of each movement. And it's really, the only thing you need to know is in the second movement, there's an upbeat. The first three notes don't count. It's da-da-da-do, da-da-dum. So it's dum, da-da-dum. And the third movement, the scherzo, dum, ba-da-dum, bum, 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 ba-da-dum. And then there's the finale, which we'll get to in a second. It just so happens that Brahms' third does exactly the same thing. You know Brahms' third, right? The second movement, da-da-da-da, bum. It's long, short, short, long. Brahms introduces that motive towards the end of his first subject in his exposition, right after that first big outburst. And from then on, it's, this is similar, very similar to what Dvořák is doing. Sometimes the two inner notes, the short notes, are dotted. So it's dum, dum, da, dum, which is how you hear it in the initial appearance in Dvořák's second movement and in Brahms's third movement. Da, 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 dum, right? But it's long, short, short, long. That's the head motive in both Dvořák's fifth and Brahms' third. And even more, yes, that's not the end. You're not going to believe it. What is even more fascinating, if that's possible, can we be more fascinating, is that the finale of Dvořák's fifth is based on the material of the second movement. Now, the B section of the second movement, as we've already heard, is that arpeggio, inverted. It's a variation, and so is the second subject of the finale. But the opening theme of the finale is simply an inversion of the opening theme of the Andante. It's a free inversion. It's not exact, but if you play them next to each other, you can hear it right away. And both contain the head motive, of course, right? So, the motivic unity in this symphony is getting to be frighteningly, fascinatingly, you would think it would sound egg-headedly, intellectually, aridly pedantic, wouldn't you? But it doesn't. It sounds totally, like I said, totally free and marvelous. You don't have to pay attention to it at all. Because that's not the point. The point isn't that you go, the head motive. The point is you just listen to the music from moment to moment for the emotional and expressive point. But it's unified. And the emotional and expressive point is more effective because it all sounds related. One thing is the outcome of what we heard previously. So now, let's listen to the opening theme of the Andante and then the opening theme of the finale. Get it? Cool, huh? I love this symphony. It is so neat because the more you listen to it, the more stuff you'll hear. I guarantee it. And just to finish up our discussion of the motivic interrelationships in this symphony, I'm going to play you just a bit of the development section of the finale, because that's where everything gets mixed up. The horns come roaring in with further development of the second subject, which is the arpeggio, da 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 da, that thing, and then the strings come wailing in with it on top, and the trumpets come in with the head motive, bum ba da da, like that, from the opening theme of the finale, which is the head motive of the whole symphony, and Dvorak proceeds to mix them all and jumble them all up in a fabulously dramatic and dynamic development section, of which this is just the beginning. So, here it is. Amazing. Absolutely amazing. So now I think you can see the incredible workmanship and thought that went into putting this symphony together. And this is the kind of stuff that I believe, and I hope you agree, that Brahms would have noticed and would have said, holy crap, this guy really knows what he's doing. And all of this, mind you, before Brahms finally released his first symphony. As you know, he'd been working on it for like 20 years. But the next year, Brahms' first symphony came out. And I wonder if that was a coincidence, having seen someone else doing work of this caliber. And the Fifth Symphony is, as Tovi pointed out, the first of Dvorak's great masterpieces. And there are quite a few of those from 1875 and before that get no attention at all. They get no attention at all because Dvorak was supposed to be this sort of naive tunesmith who didn't know anything about symphonic form. Ha! Let me tell you, boy, is that a load of hooey, because this symphony proves all of those people completely wrong. So, I'm going to put the book over here. There goes the book. Now, I hope that gives you a sense of how this symphony could have inspired Brahms in his third. Of course, Brahms' third has just as many elements that are unique to Brahms, because whatever he did came out as Brahms, not as Brahms channeling Dvorak. I'm not saying that. Brahms is not a copier. Brahms reimagined everything in his own style. But I do think that this symphony showed a way of exploring some aspects of classical technique that Brahms had not yet explored in his first two symphonies. And so he found it a useful inspiration. Now let's talk about the recordings. I'm talking about my five favorite, the top five of Dvorak's five. And the reason I'm only talking about five is because here's the deal. There are so few individual recordings of Dvorak's fifth out there. Really very, very few. It gets almost no singleton recordings. It only got them originally because they were part of cycles which have since been boxed up. And so you're more than likely to find it in a box with other things. It's very difficult to get it all by itself. And, you don't need to. You should always have a box of Dvorak. You should have dozens of boxes of Dvorak. So I'm not concerned with that. So all of these performances are now in boxes. The Shana performance on Superfon is still around singly, or it was. There's also a Shana box on Superfon, but it's in really dim mono sound and kind of gruff and muddy, and it's beautiful, but not the one to hear if you don't know the symphony well and are just looking for everything. And there are a couple of others sitting around, but I don't think they're as good as my top five. So let's talk about them. First, Maris Jansen's. I mentioned this in talking about the Maris Jansen's Oslo box. This is one of the best things he did. And I was actually very pleased that he had the vision and sense to do what still remains a lesser known and lesser performed Dvorak symphony. This is one of the best things he did in Oslo. It really is. It's a very, very fine performance. Also excellent, Witold Rawicki. This is the most exciting. I mean, his tempi, it's interesting with this cycle. The tempi are always uniformly very quick and very exciting. And I love this cycle, except, there's always got to be a fly in the ointment, except for number 7. Number 7 is kind of heavy and thick, and I don't know what happens because maybe it's Brahmsian. So they figure they're going to play it Brahmsy-like. I don't think Brahms should be heavy and thick either, but he's often played that way. And so that's how Rovitsky does this Dvorak 7th. But boy, the 5th is a slam, bang, knockout. Really exciting. Terrific. Kertész, great. And like Rovitsky, you get exposition repeats in the first movement. I like the exposition repeat in this symphony because, well, the music's just so beautiful and it's got good first-time bars. It flows back nicely. It's not random. It sounds like Dvorak intended to have it. So anyway, Kertész, it's wonderful with the LSO. It's a great cycle. Everybody knows it. I've already talked about Neumann, which is superb. This is the mono cycle. His stereo recording is also very good. I mean, stereo. They're all stereo. Let's start again, shall we? This is the analog cycle. There we go. They're all stereo. The digital one is also very good, but this analog one, I like the sound better, and I think the performance just digs deeper. It's just more trenchant, and the woodwinds have, I think, even more presence. It's a really, really good performance, and you heard bits of it for yourself, so I'm sure you can tell. So there's that one, and finally, however, my favorite, and hopefully yours, is Kubelik with the Berlin Phil. I mean, this is just, some of these performances in this cycle are so hot. And the 5th is one of them. Again, it's a symphony that doesn't get played very often. And I think when you hear a great, great conductor with a world-class orchestra really going for it in music that's unfamiliar, but which is in a style that they really, I think, enjoy and that they know, I mean, the result is absolutely incomparably fabulous. So my choice is Kubelik. For but any of those 5, I listen to them all the time. And, I have 3 of them. I have Rovitsky, Kubelik, and Kertész on my iPod. And I would probably put Neumann there if I could. They're all great. They're all great. But the important thing is that the symphony is great. And I hope these examples have given you a sense of just, how to approach it when you're listening, not to take it for granted, to keep on listening, because the music will reward you endlessly and constantly and perpetually. I guarantee it. It's magnificent. So thank you for joining me for this chat from the Overflow Room. Listen to your Dvorak 5th. You need it. It needs you. Thank you and take care.